We can give another minute or two. Welcome, everyone, to the first noontime talk of the spring semester. We're going to give it another minute to allow others to join before we get underway.
Hi, everybody.
Well, Gerard, I will get started with the introductions, and others might join as we get underway. Are you ready?
Yep,
All
take it
right.
away.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Eric Hansen, Dean of the Pollock Library. Welcome to the first of our noontime talks this semester. I'd like to introduce Dr. Gerard Beenan, Professor of Management here at CSU Fullerton. Gerard Beenan is a professor of management at CSU Fullerton, as I just stated, and an adjunct faculty member at the University of California, Irvine and Carnegie Mellon University. He is also associate editor of the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology. His research expertise is in motivation and learning in work and management education settings. He previously served as department chair, associate dean, and recent chair of the Management Education Division of the Academy of Management. Before his academic career, he was CEO of a healthcare center, co-founder of an AI startup, and a consultant with Bain and Company. He completed his PhD at Carnegie Mellon University and his MBA at Northwestern University. Today, the title of his talk is A Social Facilitation Theory Framework on Cheating Intentions in Online Assessment. The increase in online instruction makes universities vulnerable to a surge in cheating behavior and creates a need of a framework to assess the potential effectiveness of exam proctoring conditions. A social facilitation theory framework was developed to assess how four prototypical proctoring conditions, web recording, video summarization, live online, and in person, should be associated with decreasing levels of cheating. The framework was investigated in three studies. Results showed increased monitoring associated with decreased cheating intentions, with interesting asymmetries in how students and instructors perceived live online versus in person proctoring conditions. This framework can help researchers classify proctoring effectiveness and help instructors align proctoring approaches with their assessment goals. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Beenan. The floor is yours.
All right, great. Thanks. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for that introduction. And I just want to thank everybody for being here. As you see here, there's a little bit of an abbreviated title, Deterring Cheating Online, a Framework for Proctoring Effectiveness. This paper was just accepted yesterday for publication in the Journal of Management Education, which is kind of like the second top journal in the management education space. And I want to shout out to my co-author, Sinjini Mitra, in the ISDS department, as well as Ashton Gilbert, who was an alum now, who helped us as a student with some of this research. So my expectation here, by the way, is although I'm not able to monitor the chat, if you have questions, please interject. Please jump in. Oh, Sanjini's here. I see Sanjini. Great. Thanks, Sanjini. And Sanjini could jump in as well to add any of her
Yeah, I
thoughts
may have
during
to
your
jump off
presentation.
also, Gerard, but I'm here for most of the time. So
Okay,
yeah, I'll jump in if needed. Thank you.
great. Thank you.
Continue.
So if anyone has any questions along the way, please feel free to jump in and interject. And I'm going to have some points where I may have some questions for you, so I'm going to be asking you to intervene as well. And I want to actually start out with a question, which is, and maybe somebody could monitor the chat on this and you can vote or something to that effect. But how many of you noticed during COVID the acceleration in cheating behavior? Did anyone notice this in their, when we all went online, obviously? Did you start to see test scores mysteriously increase? Yes or no? That some folks can jump in on that for us. What's kind of the general temperature of the room on that one?
And I am watching the chat for you, Gerard. So
Yeah.
far, nothing's come through chat.
Okay. Anyone have anything to say on that? Any scores go up? Oh, dishwasher's ready. All right.
Got a yes.
Well,
You did get a yes
okay.
in the
Yeah.
chat.
I mean, I certainly saw scores go up. And I know I was, I think, associate dean at the time. And we looked at university level and college level GPAs and grades, across general ed classes and so forth. And there definitely was a spike and an increase. And we can kind of thank, things like Google and search engines like that. In fact, a study was done by the College Board and they looked at AP exams and they looked at the start time and the end time of those AP exams. And what you're seeing here are the spikes in keyword searches for relevant exams in calculus, English literature, and physics. So, for example, in physics, you'd see the velocity of searches for the word velocity spike and increase during the period of the AP exam. Now, in that particular case, the College Board did not prevent people from accessing the internet. So they weren't, quote, considering that cheating. And just looking up the word velocity is probably not going to help you pass an AP exam in physics. But nonetheless, the point is that easy access to these tools, particularly during online assessment, has become problematic. And so there's a need for us to kind of deal with this online testing problem. Obviously, it's a lot easier to cheat for exams that are online than in person. And we have the evidence that we just saw. The problem with this is cheating, being able to cheat easily, normalizes academic honesty. And although we won't go down this rabbit hole too far, this problem's even worse with us business school types. The business school students tend to be more apt and feel more comfortable or more likely to cheat than those in other colleges, unfortunately. So what are, some solutions to think about are alternative assessments. Those can be too time consuming, things like essay exams and so forth. E-proctoring is also kind of grown in prominence, but it does continue to face resistance. So what we want to do is we want to distinguish here proctoring from digital proctoring. And by proctoring, we define this as kind of controlling and monitoring the test-taking environment to maintain exam integrity and reduce the likelihood of student cheating. With digital proctoring, what we're talking about then are tools and software that are used to control and monitor online exams. So just to be clear, you can do digital proctoring, say, for an in-person exam, and a lot of folks do that because it's, say, easier to score, or you can just do, say, in-person proctoring without digital proctoring tools. But digital proctoring includes a whole suite and variety of tools. Now, we know from prior research that proctoring generally is effective. We know that unproctored scores, which are usually scores are usually used as a proxy for cheating in most studies. Unproctored scores tend to be higher, meaning that there's higher likelihood or probability of cheating than proctored scores. And we know that digital proctoring has been shown to be effective, especially what's called multimodal proctoring. So this might be proctoring that is monitoring, say, your ID, like you have to check in with your ID to ensure that it's you. It may include recording audio, recording video, recording clicks and screen capture and things like that, locking your screen. So that would be what multimodal is, something like Proctorio that does multiple things. It doesn't just say record your screen in the way that a unimodal digital proctoring would be, say, if you're doing a Zoom session and you're recording the Zoom session as students are taking the exam. Now, there's been some research lately. There was a review in the literature that has looked at kind of classifying proctoring conditions. And these kind of range from, you might think of less invasive to more invasive. The least invasive would be what's called video recording, which is kind of unimodal, just where you're recording the screen. Now, what benefit that might have, I don't know. We'll see in a minute when we actually look at the results. But that's not really engaging the way that, say, Proctorio or other e-proctoring software would. So video summarization is more detailed, provides a recording of the session, but also statistics like how many times did their eyes look away from the screen? Was there some evidence that there was something else going on in the room? Was there noises and things like that? Live online, which some of you may be familiar with, is there is literally another person somewhere else remotely who is in real time monitoring the exam as it's being taken. And that's what Live Online, in addition to that, they also have a suite of tools similar to video summarization. So ProctorU, it's got a different name for it now, but that is a service that we used to use in the online business administration program for monitoring online exams. Then finally, in person, which is our conventional paper and pencil. My personal favorite. Just gave an in-person exam yesterday. So, but the thing is, this spectrum of conditions has not, up to this point, been investigated, strangely. So what we know is okay, proctoring is better than not proctoring, but what is the relative effectiveness of these different proctoring conditions? So this leads us to our research question that was really motivating this research, which is what is the relative effectiveness of various proctoring conditions that can be used in online assessments in management education. Obviously, this has generalizability to a variety of higher education, and potentially even secondary education settings as well. But our focus here is management education. So how do we think about doing this and framing this theoretically? Well, social facilitation theory is an interesting theory that goes way, way back to Zayant, and it's basically this idea that when you're being watched and monitored literally by conspecifics, meaning those of the same species, that this arouses the nervous system. And this effect has been identified all the way down to even insects, like ants, experience social facilitation effects that can be observable. Nervous system arousal in the presence of conspecifics. So what this means here is that when we're being watched, by others, we feel kind of, hey, I'm being watched. This is going to activate my nervous system. And if I'm working on a task that is very well learned, this is called social facilitation, I'm going to perform that task better. Now, if I'm working on a task that's unlearned or that I'm not very good at, I'm actually going to perform worse. But our focus is on the task that you're actually able to do well. And we'll see what that task is here in a moment. Virtual presence then is this idea that this effect can be observed even when someone is not physically co-located with me, but when I feel that I'm being monitored by unseen others, including, like, say, unseen others that are online watching me through some proctoring tool or something like that, right? And the motivational mechanisms, there's a number of others, but these are the ones that we're focusing on and concentrating on, are what are called evaluation, apprehension, and self-awareness. So in other words, evaluation apprehension is this idea that, okay, if I was, say, for example, taking an exam and I know that the professor is watching me, I might be afraid that I might get caught. So that will give me evaluation apprehension that would cause me to fulfill the task of academic integrity. In this particular case of proctoring, academic integrity would be the task. Self-awareness is this notion that we have an idealized self, which presumably would be, say, a moral or an ethical self, and the experienced self, which we're experiencing in the moment. And so from the self-awareness mechanism, if I feel I am cheating, that is maybe inconsistent with my idealized self, which is, hey, generally I'm a pretty good ethical person. So that inconsistency will motivate me to, say, not cheat, because I want greater congruence between my imagined kind of idealized self and my experienced self. So this kind of shows us now where proctoring potentially fits in. Interestingly, though, social facilitation has not been used up to our study to actually examine the proctoring environment. There are analogs to proctoring. It has been used in electronic performance monitoring and work tasks, and the findings there are somewhat mixed. When the tasks are a little more complicated, people tend to choke and not do well when they feel they're being monitored. But if the tasks are very, very simple, people do tend to kind of perform a little bit better when they think they're being monitored. And there has been more recent research where they have looked at policy compliance in organizations. In this case, it was like a information security policy compliance. And when people were being monitored, they were more likely to comply with those policies. So this is very much like the task of proctoring. And in this case, instead of policy compliance, the notion is we have compliance with the social norms of honest test taking. So that's what the task is from a social facilitation perspective when we're thinking about proctoring. Now, although again, it hasn't been applied directly to the proctoring context, there are some related findings where students seemed uneasy with cheating when they're being watched in digital proctoring with digital tools, and perceptions of being watched were associated with lower online cheating behaviors. So I'm talking like through a fire hose. Any questions so far up to this point? Eric, maybe if you can monitor if there's any questions.
After your previous question, there was a comment just mentioning that most of the cheating was worse after the pandemic and related to ChatGPT and
Yeah,
AI.
yeah, that's another problem. Unfortunately, our study is not focusing on AI. We started this work before ChatGPT, but that's a problem I think. And Sinjini and I are planning to kind of move forward on another stream of research that'll go a little further on that. Now, if we apply this social facilitation framework to the prior prototypical proctoring conditions that we saw in the recent review, what we can kind of think about is, if you look here in the chart, you have lower presence to the left, higher presence to the right. This notion of presence is coming from social facilitation theory, and this is the idea that the proctoring has features that might contribute to the test taker perceiving that they're being watched and monitored. And so the notion here is that the lower the presence, potentially the the more likely you are to cheat. Whereas the more you feel you're being watched and monitored, the higher the presence, the less likely you might be willing to cheat. And so the basic idea here is that if we break down, this is just an example of some of the specific features that may or may not be available across the spectrum of proctoring conditions, then you can see that, say, for example, if you're just doing a video recording in Zoom, you're recording at the class level. I really have no information or access to individual level behaviors. Whereas with Proctorio, I do have access to individual behaviors. And if I go further to ProctorU, where it's live online, the proctor is actually controlling my computer interface and the exam environment and so forth. Whereas if I go all the way to in-person paper and pencil, now the proctor is physically co-located with me, but the exam may not be recorded through digital means as it would be, say, with a proctoring tool and proctoring system. So the basic idea here is that as we think about the typology that Holden et al. Came up with, the typology can kind of nicely be formatted into a lower to higher presence sort of spectrum. And given that, we sort of then came up with three basic hypotheses to kind of study in this research. So the first is that test takers should perceive increasing presence as we move from lower to higher concentration of these monitoring features, moving from video recording to video summarization, live online to in-person. And again, video recording is analogous to a Zoom recording. Video summarization is Proctorio. Live online would be more like ProctorU, where you have an actual person in real time using digital tools to monitor and control my screen. Next would be the mechanisms, the motivational mechanisms that associated with this increased presence. This is coming direct from social
Gerard,
facilitation
can I
theory.
interrupt you a moment?
Sure, yes, please
There
do.
is a question asking if you could explain what the low mod and high mean
Oh,
in the chat.
sorry, low mod. Is it
Emmanuel, are you able
were they
to?
referring to the prior slide?
I believe so.
Okay, let's see if we can go back to
Yeah, I
the.
was referring to the prior slide where you had low, moderate, and high. I didn't know what those
Oh,
meant.
yeah, sure. Okay, sorry. That what meant
Thank
the
you.
extent to which that feature was available. So let me show you there. Yeah, so this is the idea that, so for example, class exam is being recorded, right? So if I'm recording video with Zoom, this is sort of a low to moderate strength of presence because I can go back and look at the recording, but I don't have the granularity that I do, say, with Proctorio here, where I could actually look at each individual student taking the exam. So in Proctorio, the exam being recorded, individual exam being recorded, this is a very high kind of level of fidelity versus in Zoom, I don't even have that ability, so it's not even there. Um, Whereas if I'm in person, I have a low ability to maybe monitor individual behaviors, but I have a high control over the exam interface. I could make it paper and pencil. I can control the environment. I could say you can't go to the bathroom during the exam, etc. I could tell you to put your phones and your watches and all materials except paper and pencil away. So does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
great. Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. Okay, so next up was this idea that we're focusing on the motivational mechanisms from social facilitation theory. And so those are evaluation, apprehension, and self-awareness. We don't have any theory for why one would be stronger than the other and so forth. So we just want to see that these should be negatively associated with intentions to cheat across these different spectrum of proctoring environments or conditions. And then finally, that the test takers should have decreasing intentions to cheat across the spectrum of proctoring conditions that we previously in hypothesis one were expecting or predicting to have lower to higher presence. So as presence increases from video recording to in person being the highest degree of presence, we would expect um, the highest proportion of intentions to cheat to be evident in, say, I'm using a Zoom, and then the lowest cheating would be for an actual in-person exam. So, any questions about the hypotheses so far? Now, social facilitation theory is about the person being observed. But when it comes to proctoring, it's important to remember, well, the instructor is pretty important here. The instructor is the one giving the exam. The instructor is the one perceiving how much control they have over the exam and so forth. So we kind of have a research question here that's really important, which is what about the proctor? To what extent do instructors perceive they can actually monitor or control the conditions in a way that matches how students are perceiving they are being monitored? Because in an ideal world, the instructors feel, okay, I have control. Students understand that control in the context of presence, and there's some sort of symmetry between how instructors perceive they're controlling the test taking environment, whether they're using Proctorio, ProctorU, or in person, or Zoom, or whatever they're using, or not even proctoring at all, versus how students are perceiving those individual conditions. So we want to see is this symmetrical, or is there some asymmetries there that may be worth kind of exploring? So we did this research in 3 different studies. Study one is within subjects repeated measures where we looked at 395 students, 113 faculty. The studies were scenario based. I'll give you an example to show you what the scenarios look like for the students and the faculty in a moment. But we basically presented the subjects with 4 proctoring scenarios presented in random order in order to control for ordering effects. And those were then used to assess the degree of presence that students perceived, the degree of faculty of control that faculty perceived within each condition. And this study one was used to test the first hypothesis and the research question. Study two then was again within subjects repeated measures, again scenario based. This one was a little different though because we wanted to assess evaluation apprehension, namely self-awareness, self-awareness and evaluation apprehension, the motivational mechanisms, and we wanted to see if they're predicting cheating intentions. We also wanted to check the cheating intentions across the spectrum of proctoring conditions. So again, presented in randomized order to control for ordering effects. But these were both scenario-based studies. So in study three, we were able to actually randomly assign students to conditions in 5 different classes, adding to the 4 proctoring conditions, adding an unproctored baseline so we could actually extend and try to replicate prior research that showed that unproctored exams tend to have higher scores than proctored exams. But in this case, we're breaking down the proctored exams not just to undifferentiated proctoring, but we were actually looking at the four proctoring conditions that were included in studies 1 and 2, the same exact conditions, but in real life. So this was a field study. And so the purpose of study 3 then was to retest hypothesis 3 a second time using actual exam scores as a proxy for cheating instead of just hypothetical cheating intentions under those scenarios. Any questions about the studies or the designs? Okay, so to give you just a visual feel, um, it's a little bit small maybe for you to see, but this was, a full screen size for students to see. Again, students were presented these in random order, but they were taken through basically 3 stages or 3 steps. A lot of students were, they're all familiar with Zoom. Many are familiar with Proctorio. They're all familiar with in-person. Some may or may not have been familiar with ProctorU, but it's taking you through the steps of here's what you do. You log in, you see everybody, in the Zoom case or in the ProctorU case, you see a proctor on the other line and he asks you to give control of your computer to him and then he asks you to see your camera and he brings up the exam and he's watching you in a little window during your whole exam. So you feel like, the instructors are being watched. And then finally, you walk into an empty room and there's an instructor giving you a paper pencil exam after they ask you to clear your desk of phones and things like that. And it's a closed book exam in all cases, right? So these are the different scenarios that are intended to be kind of lower to higher presence. Now, so to do this, those of you who may not be familiar with social science methods or others, we're basically had to create new measures here for presence and control in study 1. And so in order to do this, what we needed to do is we needed to kind of do what's called a confirmatory factor analysis. And what this is doing is it's basically a way to statistically assess the extent to which our measures are representing the constructs, namely the 4 different scenarios of presence and the 4 different scenarios in the case of faculty of control that we were intending to measure. And what these results show is that they did indeed. So these measures, the CFI, RMSEA, SRMR. These are CFI should be above 90 generally. RMSEA, SRMR should usually be around 0.08 or lower. So our RMSEA was a little bit on the higher end, but still kind of within acceptable range. So this basically is saying that our hypothesized 4-factor model of representing the 4 conditions for presence and representing the 4 conditions for control for the faculty sample, that those hypothesized measures worked as intended, and they did indeed load on 4 factors. And to get a little bit more technical, the data are skewed, so we did what's called a Bollenstein bootstrapping, which is a way to kind of generate randomized samples from your subsample in order to account for the fact that we had a skewed distribution, because normally these measures are assuming a normally distributed data set. But since our data were not normally distributed, we had to do the bootstrapping in order to account for that. But it was all good and all the measures were fine. So results. So what you're looking at here, the light gray and the dark gray. The light gray is the test taker measure of perceptions of presence on a 0 to 5 scale, where 7 is, very high presence and 0 is very low presence. So, and then the dark gray is the instructor perception, right? So here, what you're seeing is that for test takers, condition 1 video recording is statistically significantly less than condition 2, which was statistically significantly less than condition 3, which was statistically not any different from condition 4. So basically what we're seeing here then, in other words, is from a student perceptual perspective, there is a lot more presence in person and in the live online scenario where there's another face looking at you and monitoring you throughout the entire exam. So you feel like you're being watched in that regard, just like an instructor, that that condition is basically not any different from a student perspective from what they experience in person. Whereas Proctorio is significantly less presence, but still pretty high and a lot higher, significantly higher than just, say, recording it using Zoom, which is not really that effective. And instructors as well, although their numbers are quite different, the same similar pattern, but there's some interesting asymmetry here is that for the instructors, video recording using Zoom, that's pretty useless, and most of us would agree with that, is not as effective as Proctorio, but they viewed Proctorio as about the same as using ProctorU, which was interesting, and ProctorU as significantly less effective than in person. And this is discrepant perception from students because students actually viewed those two as the same, whereas instructors viewed them not as effective as each other. So this finding is kind of interesting from our perspective. We weren't really looking for it, but there it is. Study two. Now we had more factors to look at. We had to develop measures for cheating intentions, and the cheating intention measures were basically kind of three ways of cheating, like looking at uh, your phone, look using a chat like a Discord or something like that, or some other ways of measuring or assessing or accessing unauthorized material during the exam. That was one of the factors. The second factor was so that's cheating intentions. The second one was evaluation apprehension. The third one is self-awareness. Okay, so what we were doing is looking at those three factors. And we had to do those different measures for each scenario. So we have three factors that we're trying to hypothesize that we want to measure for each of the four scenarios. And similar to the others, we had robust measures here and using, again, Bolenstein bootstrapping because there was some of the items, particularly I think it was the cheating intentions were negatively skewed. The others, I think, were closer to normally distributed, but because of the negative skewing, we had to do bootstrapping. All of those measures, as expected, performed as intended. So we had valid measures and the results. So here, what you're seeing are the real one that counts mostly is the gray, the darkest gray with the numbers on them. What these are is these are the subjective probability of me cheating in each scenario. So from a student perspective, we're asking them, um, and they knew that there's no repercussions to answering. They're answering this completely anonymously, and they're not going to be penalized for saying they would have cheated in this scenario or that. So, there was some comfort there from that perspective, but the numbers still, from my perspective, look a little bit lower than they probably would in real life. But directionally, what we found was what we were expecting for a hypothesis two, which is, the percentage probability of cheating on average was about 7.2, 5 for using Zoom, for using Proctorio about 5.1, for using ProctorU about 4.7, and for cheating in person about 3.1%. So in other words, I'm saying as a student, I would have about a 3% likelihood that I might cheat if in person. In other words, if the instructor's like looking around or takes a bathroom break or something, I might duck out and cheat a little bit before they get back. That's the kind of idea there going on. Whoops. Wanted to make sure, see if there's any questions there. So here, the probability of cheating for Zoom is significantly higher than video summarization, which is significantly higher than live online, which is significantly higher than in person. So those differences were statistically significant. Then the other bars that you see are the individual behaviors comprising the composite measure, using a hidden device, accessing external resources, or consulting with another during the exam. Any questions about this result from anyone?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, great. Thanks. For the motivational mechanisms, here what we're looking at is we were looking at evaluation apprehension and self-awareness was expected to predict cheating intentions, and we would expect this relationship to be negative. In other words, the higher my evaluation apprehension, The higher my self-awareness, the lower my likelihood of cheating. So we expect a negative coefficient across all scenarios, and we expect that coefficient to be significant. In this regression, so we ran this as regression models, and the regression models, we were controlling for GPA because that has been shown to kind of predict cheating. Actually, lower GPA might be more likely to be associated with cheating. So here for evaluation apprehension, across the four conditions, the evaluation apprehension coefficient was significant, controlling for GPA at the individual level. Same for self-awareness. For each condition, the self-awareness coefficient was significant. Any questions about this? So basically what we're saying is that the social facilitation mechanisms actually worked, that they do prevent people or they are negatively associated with cheating. So the more I feel, hey, somebody's watching me, I better look out, the less I'm likely to cheat. The more I feel kind of a sense of conscience that, like, I don't really want to feel like I'm a bad person here. The more I feel that sense of conscience, like, say, for example, I'm being pushed an honor code reminder or a realistic warning of what happens if I get caught. Those kinds of things might deter me from cheating and raise my self-awareness. Although we didn't do those manipulations in here. Any questions about this? Nope. All right, great. And then next, this was just more exploratory. We didn't have any specific hypotheses about this, but we wanted to just kind of assess the different strengths of each motivational mechanism across the four conditions. So here what we found was evaluation apprehension was lowest for video recording and higher for video summarization and higher still for live online. But interestingly, evaluation apprehension was higher for live online than in person. In other words, you might be able to say this in a different way, that people feel a little more nervous if they're using an online proctor where there is a person in real time that's actually monitoring them than they would feel in person just taking a paper and pencil exam, which is actually kind of interesting and explains at least some of the pushback that maybe some of us have felt with some of these electronic tools. From a self-awareness perspective, flat across the board, except in person. So this one's kind of interesting too to me because it's basically saying, well, yeah, I kind of I'd feel crappy about myself if I was cheating in any of these situations. But if the instructor's in the room, I feel really crappy about it. I feel, at least significantly crappier about it. It's not a huge difference that you see, but it is statistically significant, and it's significant at a, fairly small level, meaning that it's not a small effect, it's a measurable effect here. Any question about this before we move on? All right, great. We're gliding through. So study 3. Now this one's interesting. It looks great. So study 3, you remember what we did was we looked at the four conditions that we were looking at in studies 1 and 2. And we added a baseline unproctored condition in order to extend prior findings because unproctored is kind of the gold standard for raising the cheating bar. So to see cheating happen, to see the score as high as possible, you do an unproctored exam. So what we saw here is kind of mixed bag because if you look at it, it's like, yeah, this is exactly what we were hoping for. The problem is when you look at, when you look at the actual statistical significance, what we found is that unproctored and Zoom are actually not different from each other, but the unproctored is there's more cheating going on than actually the sign there is the opposite of what it should be. You should see the sign in the other way. 0 should be greater than 2, which sounds weird, but condition 0, which is unproctored, had a significantly higher score than Proctorio, ProctorU, and in person, which was conditions 2, 3, and 4. But unproctored and Zoom conditions 0 and 1 were not actually different from each other, which is interesting, but it had to do with the size of these classrooms and the size of the subjects in each class. They ranged from 39 to 52. And I think what we had was we had smaller sample sizes in some of these, and it increased the threshold for seeing statistically significant effects. If I think in reality, if these numbers were in the hundreds instead of like 35 to 50 or something like that, we probably would have seen significant effects. But it's very, very difficult to do this kind of research with classes of that size. So, and the window is closed because these kinds of conditions are so specific and esoteric that it was really hard to get a situation where everything else in the class was exactly the same. And the only difference was the modality in which they took exam one. And in this case, we also were controlling, these are ANCOVAs, so we're actually controlling for student GPA in each of these. So that was a fairly robust control. So overall, it showed what we were hoping it could show, but the significance was not there, unfortunately. So to kind of wind down and wrap up, and again, anyone want to jump in if they have questions or other comments or anything like that, is that what we've been able to do, and I don't know if I had mentioned in the onset, I think I did, this paper has just got accepted for publication in Journal of Management Education, so we're excited about it because this is really, to our knowledge, the first study that has empirically, even using both field data and scenario studies, to monitor or to assess the effectiveness of a range of proctoring approaches. Typically, studies are basically looking at e-proctoring, and they'll look at it very vaguely. They're not defining it clearly. They're comparing e-proctoring with unproctored. They're comparing e-proctoring with in-person, but there's been no granularity to say, well, let's look at actually, we're looking here at literally 4 ways that you can proctor an online exam, including in person, because you can do it in person, and we're looking at the range of effectiveness. So that, I think, is a significant contribution to this literature. Also, extending social facilitation theory to proctoring, where the task being facilitated here is ethical adherence to, say, an honor code or, ethical taking of an exam. That's the task. Policy compliance with exam, honest test taking policy. And we found social facilitation theory generally works. There was that little quirk in what we're going to look at in a moment when we see the asymmetries. Stronger perceptions and presence generally were associated with lower cheating intentions. There was that one exception where live online and in person were kind of roughly viewed equivalently from a student perspective. One of the factors in that, and this isn't even in the paper, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, could have been the fact that students are perceiving, like, if imagine taking a test where you've got a little snapshot, like me, I'm a talking head here, but the proctor's not going to be talking, but you see a little snapshot in live video feed of a proctor who's looking at you while you're taking the exam. I don't know about you, but that would kind of make me pretty nervous. So it may not be that surprising to think that the live online condition had just as high a presence as the in-person condition. But the cheating intentions did meet our predictions neatly according to kind of a social facilitation theory. What was really interesting here, we thought, was the asymmetry between students and faculty. Again, so for students, live online was about equivalent in presence to in person, whereas for faculty, the Proctorio was about equivalent to live online, which was kind of interesting. And we're not sure if that's because faculty didn't really understand the nuances of live online or what was going on there, or they just feel like, no, I need to take charge, I need to be in the room, that kind of a thing. We're not really sure what might be the cause of that. But here, sort of, you see a visual of this, and let's kind of explain this visual here for a moment. So what we did was we combined the results of study 1 and study 2. And if you see here on the vertical axis, you have high versus low control. On the horizontal axis, you have high versus low presence, right? So this is the student perception. This is the instructor perception. And what we did was we sort of grand mean centered So in other words, the average for presence and control, we set the average to 0. And so this is showing you, the baseline of 0, 0. And we're looking then for each condition what the average score was. So here to interpret this, for example, for a student, this was their how they perceive presence, and we see presence was the highest in person for students. It was also the highest for instructors for control. So this is where you see the discrepancy show up, is in this kind of off the diagonal. Because if it was perfectly calibrated and perfectly symmetrical, we would have seen all of the presence and control data points along this diagonal here. Now, what this diagonal is representing, this is representing somewhat of a hypothetical, and this data point is kind of pulling us a little towards that hypothetical. You can imagine a situation where, for example, the instructor thinks, oh, I've got a lot of control over this test-taking environment. Maybe it's an in-person exam, but they're not thinking about the fact that, yeah, but everybody's got an Apple Watch in the room and they're communicating using their Apple Watch during the exam. And if the instructor is not thinking through that, there may be a situation where the students are going, huh, totally low presence, dude. So I'm over here, instructor's thinking, oh, I've got control of the room. But in reality, everybody's communicating on their iWatches or their Apple Watches. And so you have a very low presence scenario with a very high instructor perception of control. Vice versa, there may be situations where an instructor doesn't feel they have a lot of control. And this was maybe in the case of, say, for example, the Proctor U case, where students felt like they were really being watched, but instructors felt, yeah, it's kind of middling level of control. I don't have a lot of control here. But students felt there was a lot more control in that case than instructors did. So the basic idea is to really sort of try to get inside the student's shoes to understand how might they perceive it, and also to increase the student's awareness or level of awareness that they're being watched and monitored, to increase presence. So I think these asymmetries in presence are interesting, and they kind of warrant some additional future research questions. Is what's going on here? Are students just gotten so used to online exams that in person is equivalent to live online? Or is it something else, like I mentioned, where it's just literally the artifact of having that postage stamp person in the corner of my screen that's watching me is just a constant reminder that, hey, I'm being monitored and watched here, and I better be careful.
Gerard,
Yes.
I'm wondering if it's generational almost because, as you said, the students, that idea of presence with live online in person was very close for the students, but not for the faculty or the teacher. And I wonder if
Yes.
growing up in a world of social media and online, they still feel just as watched, even though they're on a screen, whereas the faculty member who's teaching still kind of separates that out and likes to be there with them, and they can see everything and is maybe concerned about what's going on outside of the view of the screen.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that could be, this is what our conjecture was, at least in our discussion section of our paper. And I do think that there's definitely something to be said for that. There's generational differences. This is sort of a native online generation. They've gone through, many of them, not all, have gone through COVID, and they even in high school or whatever. And it's like taking exams online. Yeah, I'm so used to it. If someone's watching me online and I see them, yeah, it feels just like I'm in person. I think you're probably right. And then us faculty, us old timers, we're a little less native to that technology. Um, there's some limitations here, obviously. Scenario studies 1 and 2 were scenario based, so they're not real. We didn't use manipulation checks for the conditions, and part of the reason for that is it just would have been too cumbersome. We really wanted to do a within subject study here so that students could be, randomly viewing all the scenarios so we could get kind of their perception versus sort of between subjects. But if we would have added manipulation checks here, I think it would have been a little bit clunky and a little bit longer, but it's still nonetheless a limitation of the study. For study 2 also, we're asking about cheating. I think cheating here, to be frank, was probably underestimated. There's been some Other studies, like during the pandemic, where cheating really ramped up to almost like 50%, and then ramped down to like more like into the high teens or the 20s. So my hunch is that our numbers are probably on the lower end. Nonetheless, I think that we saw the directional effects that we were expecting. We did not control for social desirability. Had we done so, maybe we would have seen slightly stronger effects and so forth. And then for study 3, again, relatively small sample, and there could be other reasons to account for those score differences, to be perfectly frank. There could have been motivational differences, time of day differences, the classes were at different times, compositional differences. There were some demographic differences between the classes. Some of these could potentially account for differences in scores. But nonetheless, we did control for GPA, which I think is probably going to be the highest thing to consider in terms of effects. So for future research, we really think this idea of exploring the future, exploring these asymmetries in the future between student and faculty perceptions. And as Eric had pointed out, it may be that students are so digitally native that they don't kind of view the difference. But it's also possible students may be underestimating instructors' in-person control, but instructors certainly may be underestimating the efficacy of digital proctoring. At least, I mean, one thing this is suggesting is that digital proctoring does deter some cheating. It's not as effective as in person, but it does have some deterrent effect. Strategies need to kind of increase, though, to increase perceptions of presence on the part of students in order to reduce those cheating intentions. Also, this little bit of a jump, I wouldn't call it a spike, it's more like a little bump in self-awareness with in-person and a dip in evaluation apprehension. So maybe these different approaches are kind of activating different social facilitation mechanisms. One hunch is that electronic monitoring is facilitating more of a fear that I'm going to get caught, whereas the in-person monitoring, like with an in-person exam, is appealing more to my ethical awareness that I don't want to feel like a crappy person. So self-awareness was a little bit more activated in person, whereas evaluation apprehension was more activated in the digital proctoring scenarios. And then finally, there may be other motivational mechanisms going on. So, for example, if any of you with psych backgrounds familiar with what's called regulatory focus theory, the idea of regulatory focus theory is that we have motivational systems that activate vigilance or avoidance, and another motivational system that activates approach or promotion. And so one notion is that the idea of we become more vigilant with a higher presence. With the more we're being monitored, I'm going to be more and more vigilant, increasingly vigilant to avoid being caught cheating. Whereas if presence is less available and I feel like I'm not really being very monitored, I'm going to be activating more of an approach or a promotion focus, which is going to cause me to engage in like the opportunity to exploiting the opportunities to cheat in that scenario. Then finally, in terms of applications, looks like we're right on time, landing the plane here at 12:55, is this idea of using this framework to raise monitoring awareness. So as instructors, we really need to recognize these potential perceptual asymmetries. So I think if anything, this kind of framework helps instructors to kind of empathize or think about what is it like to be a student if I'm taking this exam online in a way that makes them not uncomfortable, but lets them know that we don't want them to cheat. So we want to do it in a way that's kind of not raising their nervousness that's going to cause their performance to dip, but we want to be empathetic with how students are perceiving it, but also recognize our own biases and how there may be asymmetries between we may think we're in control, but if everybody's got Apple Watches and they're like strangely looking at what time it is during the exam, they may not be checking the time. They may be checking Discord and communicating with each other in real time. Also, this idea of using honor codes and realistic threats, these could potentially increase self-awareness so that students don't feel that they're going to be cheating as much. Finally, this idea of calibrating presence based on how high of a stakes the exams are. So for me personally, for example, I have quizzes in my undergraduate course, and those quizzes are not monitored, they're not proctored. And the reason for that is I just want students to kind of absorb the material. I don't care if they're talking to friends when they're doing it. I don't have any care at all about it because I want them to just sort of learn that material. And so that's a very sort of low stakes quiz environment that is completely unproctored, and I'm comfortable with that. But in taking an actual exam, that's a higher stakes situation. And even higher stakes would obviously be things like medical boards or exams that are for certifications and things like that. And then finally, I think what this study is showing us, which is what our intuition would tell us, is in person, paper and pencil, whenever possible. Clear your desk, put away your phones, turn off your phones, put away your backpacks. You're only allowed caffeinated beverages, paper, and pencil on the desk. That's it. And and now I'm thinking I need to, because I did have a student looking at his watch yesterday during the exam, I'm thinking that looks kind of strange. I should have walked over there, but I may be having to ask students to take their watches off during the exams in the near future. But that is basically it. So open up for questions. I have the actual, I have correlation tables, regression tables. If people actually are interested in that kind of thing and want to see the data, I have all that in backup slides. But otherwise, happy to answer questions, or if there's other discussions or observations. We landed the plane right on time here. So thanks, Eric. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Gerard. I'm not seeing any questions, and we're getting real close to the 1 o'clock hour here, in which I want to allow people to get back to things they're working on. I enjoyed it because of my background in distance education. So thank you. I've
Sure.
dealt with Proctorio and some of those companies, so it was interesting to me. Well,
Well,
with
thanks,
that,
everybody.
yeah, thank you very
I'll hang
much. I
out for
appreciate
till
it.
whenever. So, folks.
It looks like people are signing out. If you are interested, Gerard, in the recording, I believe we can get it to you. We don't do anything with it without your permission.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no, you can do whatever
Yeah.
you want with it.
Hey, Gerard, do you have time for a quick question?
Oh, sure, John.
Um, I'm just wondering about the relative cost of these things. Like, how much does it? Yeah, the cheapest thing you can do is have a paper and pencil test in person, right? It just seems like having a specific person logging into each student's computer to monitor their computer as they're taking the test is a fairly resource-intensive operation, but I've never used it, so
Well, I
I
think
would
they're
like.
doing it I think they're probably monitoring 6 or 7 exams doing that at the same time. So
Okay,
they've got a dashboard. They're probably on their end. I don't know. They may even be doing more than that now. I don't know what it looks like on their end, but on the student end, yeah.
and
And
how
and
much is it?
those are expensive. I think it's probably like 15, $20, maybe even more now per exam.
Okay, that makes sense. All
Eric
right.
would know more. Eric, what do you know
They're
about
very
those?
expensive programs. We had institutional subscriptions when I was at Glendale, and we had to justify the price for the usage because many faculty weren't using it because of concerns with privacy and such. There were those who really wanted it, but it's expensive. Proctorio was very expensive.
Yeah, we used to use it in our online business administration program, and they switched it to Proctorio. Um, I thought it was okay. We had problems sometimes. There were password issues, and I'd be on the I'm in Big Bear right now skiing. I skied this morning, but it would be like I'd be on the slopes or whatever, and I can't log into my test. Okay, that's not working out well.
All right. Okay, well, I'm sick on my couch, so I'd love to trade places with you.
Well, I hope you're feeling better. Go
Of
Chargers.
course. You
Yeah.
bet. Enjoy the slopes, and thanks
All
for that.
right,
Get
thanks,
better,
That's great
John.
John.
Thanks
information.
for joining in.
You bet. Bye bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Gerard.